Beautiful.
Let me actually, for a second, break out of your question and build on what Rick just said, which is so powerful. We have a mutual friend who had a son who was born, and within hours they discovered that he had a very, very rare heart problem. And there were only like 3 people in the country who could solve it. And they literally had to go that night. He had like 24 hours as a brand new baby. They went to the first doctor and decided they didn't really trust him because he had exactly the attitude you were talking about, which is, well, we can try, but they almost never survive. And so then jumped in a car, ran to New York City to the second of the 3 people who can do this particular operation. Decided they liked the guy, they trusted him. They had the operation. And the doctor came out and said, well, in preparing for the operation's successful, and I think we're going to be able to fix your son's heart. However, in the process of doing that, we discovered he has brain tumors. They then went through 6 years at Johns Hopkins of, at appropriate moments, taking out each of the tumors. They weren't cancerous, they were just tumors that were going to kill him. And so this little boy, he's a very close friend, he spent 6 years with a shunt in the back of his head. And he spent 6 years knowing that in a couple of months I'll go back, I'll go through another operation. They finally, in the 6th year, went back, and the doctor's fussing around, and the little kid looks up and says, look, can we just get this over with so I can get this shunt out so I can go play football? Now, he today has a good heart, a good brain, is good at baseball and football. He was the assistant director of one of my movies. We have a great outtake of him saying, why can't he learn his lines? And you look at that, and I just want to build on what Rick was saying. You look at that and you say to yourself, all right, do I want some bureaucracy deciding that on a percentage basis this is not worth the investment? Or do I want a country that cares about every life at that depth? That is what next year is all about.
If I can take the moderator's prerogative to listen to the stories of you and the challenges that you all have faced and what you have survived. It's strange to me to see in some of these debates why you have gone at each other when you have so much to contribute and you have achieved so much and you're so admirable in terms of character. I would hope this may get me fired, truthfully, but I would hope that you would realize that you have more that you agree on than those small things that you disagree on, and that you carry yourselves this way through the rest of the campaign. You always stand up and tell people what you succeeded, what you believe in. Again, through this research, I know that some of you have had significant failures in life. And we all know that you probably learn more from what doesn't go right than what does. Could I ask several of you to identify something in your career or your personal life that didn't work out, that didn't reach the standard that you might have had, and how that informed you and how that will make you a better president in 2013?
I'll be glad to start this time. I was born, a little bit like Dr. Paul, I was born in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. And when I was about 2, my mother divorced and remarried a couple years later. And I was born in McPherson. I was adopted and became McGingrich, my stepfather's name. And in that period, my mother was working, and I had a grandmother who really raised me and spent a lot of the time raising me. And she was a very old-fashioned, very deeply religious person. And so between the time I was 2 and about 5, she worked very hard to make sure I understood that there was heaven and hell, and that one was preferable and the other wasn't. And she was fairly vivid in explaining the concept. I went through a relatively complex life because my dad was a career soldier. So I grew up originally in Pennsylvania in the Lutheran church and sang in the boys' choir and did the things you do in a small town. Then became, for example, a Presbyterian acolyte at one point because you basically became whatever the Protestant chaplain was as you moved around the world. And I would have said that I was a pretty religious person. It had been driven very deeply by my grandmother. And after I got married and things became more complicated, we had two wonderful daughters. Although I was remarkably successful in many ways, I was a PhD, I was a congressman, had a lot of very exciting things going on. There was a part of me that was truly hollow. And it was almost like the harder I worked and the more things I did, the hollower I got inside. And finally, a friend of mine who was a banker in Griffin, Georgia, actually gave me the two books that are the base of Alcoholics Anonymous. Now, I wasn't drinking, but I had precisely the symptoms of somebody who was collapsing under this weight. And I found myself, as an emerging national figure, reading the big book and trying to understand where I had failed and why I was empty and why I had to turn to God. And I think that had I not had that experience, and I had not had that intervention, I might literally have collapsed totally. And that was really the beginning of turning my life around and beginning to help me understand. And it's, I've been very, very fortunate, very blessed. Clista and I have a wonderful marriage. We're very close to our two daughters, Kathy and Jackie, and their husbands. And as many of you know, I'm extremely close to Maggie and Robert, who are my two grandchildren. But all of that has required a great deal of pain, some of which I have caused, others which I regret deeply. All of it has required having to go to God to seek both reconciliation, but also to seek God's acceptance, that I had to recognize how limited I was and how much I had to depend on him. And I was asked at one of the events we did whether I'd be comfortable with somebody who was an atheist as president. And I answered from the heart, which is I said no. And the reason is simple. I think if it's, we once had a friend who was a recovering alcoholic who was approached by a federal official who said, if you all could drop the second step, we could fund the other 11 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous. But the second step's the one that says you recognize there's a higher being. And he said to him, I think you misunderstand why it works. And if you said to me, we were electing somebody who believed that they by themselves were strong enough to be president of the United States, I would tell you that person terrifies me because they completely misunderstand how weak and how limited any human being is.